What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be going over everything Druid for Season 4 after we review the official patch notes on yesterday's live stream. And honestly, guys, in my opinion, they really missed the mark in terms of the changes they made to the Druid. However, that does not mean that there are not some positives here, so we will be going over those in this video. And that doesn't mean that I think the class is going to be suffering going into Season 4. I still think it's going to be a pretty well-rounded class in terms of all the content. However, I do think that Season 4 Druid is pretty much going to look exactly like this season's Druid and not really changing the meta whatsoever as it currently stands. So let's go ahead and go over all of these changes, and I'll give my opinion on each one, and then I'm going to show you guys the basic framework for every single Druid build that's probably going to exist in Season 4. So starting off here with the Spirit Boons, you can see that Pack Leader got a nice little buff. It is now 25% chance to reset your cooldowns on your companion skills instead of the previous 20%. Now, I, for one, have been asking for this specific boon to be buffed. However, I do not think this is substantial enough. I was hoping it would be buffed into the 30 to 40% range, and I think that would be a lot better overall for more consistent procs off of Pack Leader. However, it's still really nice to get a buff to that, no matter how minimal it is. And I do think with all the changes that are coming to companions, along with this small buff, it is going to make companion builds feel a lot better overall. And also, if you do plan on running a subterranean / trample slide build, this is going to be really nice for you as well. Going down to Energize, it says Spirit Restoration increased from 10 to 20. Now, in my opinion, this was not the problem with Energize. The problem with Energize is the fact that it only works on a lucky hit, and it has a very low % chance to proc when you do get a lucky hit. So until they change that, I still feel like this boon overall is absolutely trash, and I do not think that is hyperbolic in any way. And I hope that at some point in time, they do go ahead and decide to rework the lucky hit % chance and make it a lot higher chance to proc. Going down to Masochistic, you'll see we're getting a 2% increase. So instead of 3% life, we're getting 5% life. Now, again, in my opinion, this is not the problem with Masochistic. The problem with Masochistic is that when they nerfed it, they made it a lucky hit with a 75% chance to proc on a critical hit, which makes it where you're not really getting a whole lot out of Masochistic compared to what you were getting when you had a 100% chance off of a critical strike hit to get a 3% heal to your character. So my overall wish is that they would go ahead and revert the nerf back to the previous form of Masochistic. It doesn't really need to give you more life. It just needs to be more consistent healing for your character, so that way you can survive without needing to use barriers. Going down to the skills, we see Claw is getting another damage buff, as well as Enhanced Claw getting an attack speed increase. Now, I'm always going to welcome any increases to the basic skill abilities, and I'm definitely happy that Claw is getting a buff here. So this combined with the fact that you're now going to be able to get basic skill ranks on your gear pieces is probably going to make making a Stormclaw build a lot better going into Season 4. However, I still think it's not going to be anywhere near as good as some of the other core skill builds out there. And at the end of the day, you're probably still going to prefer utilizing some of those builds to push higher tier pit levels. Going down to Maul, you can see here we're getting a damage increase as well, and we're getting an increase to the Fortify amount you're getting from Enhanced Maul. Now, again, in my opinion, this misses the mark on what we really need with Maul. I believe Maul needs a lot more damage here from Enhanced Maul. So typically what you see with the Werebear Werewolf change off is that Werewolf has faster movement speed and much faster attack speed, and typically Werebear has more damage and a lot more damage reduction. However, with Maul, that's just simply not the case, and honestly, I really wish they would remove this Fortify increase and turn it into a damage multiplier of some type for Maul, and then also make some slight changes around the Crone Staff to actually affect Maul as well as Claw, so that way players out there who wanted to build a basic skill attack build on your Werebear could potentially do that. However, with these changes, it's still going to leave Maul pretty much the worst overall basic skill that we have on Druid, and no one's really going to use it outside of a few people who are probably using it for thematic purposes. Now we see they're also making some changes to the Raging Pulverize passive, so they're increasing the stun duration from 2 to 3 seconds, so nothing really too big for Pulverize. However, I do feel like Pulverize is in a good place currently. Now for Shred, it looks like we're getting a nice little 10% damage increase here for Shred, as well as Enhanced Shred is getting an increase to the overall heal that it's going to give you. So now from 2%, it's going to be 4%. So this is a pretty nice change to Shred overall. However, I don't think it's going to change its place in the meta for Druid. So it will still probably be really great for the Gauntlet, almost exclusively the best builds for the Gauntlet because of how the Gauntlet is designed. But outside of that, I don't think you're going to see Shred pushing those super high tiers of Pit. Now for Debilitating Roar, you see here it's not going to be categorized as a shout skill. Now this isn't really a big change here. They're just changing the tag on it. They're also doing this for Bloodhouse, so both of those skills are going to be categorized as shout skills, and that will play into another change that they made further down on the patch notes. Looking at Wolves, it now says Wolves will gain Unstoppable when the skill is cast. Now to me, this is pretty insignificant overall. In my opinion, what Wolves are lacking the most is A, tankiness. They die way too fast in higher tier content, and B, they definitely need to increase the amount of wolves that we can have at any given time. My hope is that they will eventually increase it to maybe 5 or 6 wolves or even more because of the amount of monsters that are coming at our player character at any given time. And then also I hope at some point in time they give us a grizzly bear, but I will not hold my breath on that. However, I do think companion builds are going to be more viable going into season 4, and I will be updating my companion build for the Druid, but I do not think it's really going to change their place in the meta overall because you're still going to be heavily depending on your pack leader procs to actually deal most of your damage. And just the fact that we don't have as many companions is what actually limits companion builds overall in terms of their viability going into the end game. Going down to Petrify, now this is not an ultimate I expected them to buff because it was already the go-to ultimate for most builds across the game, but they gave Petrify a massive buff and pretty much made it the only ultimate worth using outside of Grizzly Rage builds that take advantage of Dire Bear or Dire Werewolf, but I don't even know why you would use those anymore. This is just absolutely ridiculous. So now Prime Petrify is going to give us 50 Spirit when it's cast, and we're also getting that duration increase. But the big one here is Supreme Petrify. So instead of giving us 25 Spirit for every enemy killed, it's now going to reduce the cooldown of Petrify by 1 second for every enemy we kill, and we're also getting a whopping 10-second cooldown when Petrify hits bosses. So this is going to be absolutely crazy and probably the only ultimate most Druids run for the entirety of Season 4, barring any significant buffs in the mid-season to different ultimates. And I don't know exactly why they buffed this one, but I'll take it because it's just going to make Petrify that much better. And this is probably one of the bigger changes from these patch notes, just making Petrify this much better. And I hope eventually they do that with some of the other ultimates. But until they do, it's going to be the same thing as it is in Season 3. Everybody's going to run Petrify because it is just too good not to run. Going down to Lacerate, you see here they are increasing the damage of Lacerate, and they're also changing some of the effects of the passive skills. So the previous version of Lacerate says hits heal for 3% max life doubled on crit strikes. It now is going to be hits heal for 3% max life doubled on crit strikes, but the first critical strike is guaranteed and deals 150% increased damage. Then for Supreme Lacerate, the previous version says initial strike is guaranteed to critically strike and deals 150% increased damage. Now it says whenever Lacerate critically strikes, your shape-shifting skills deal 4% increased damage for 10 seconds up to 40%. Now this actually sounds pretty interesting, albeit a little bit too complicated to get that damage increase. So I don't actually think it's going to change its place in terms of overall Druid builds. I think Petrify is just far too easy to use and far too convenient to use, as where this is going to lock the player in place for a certain period of time and kind of really slow your character down overall. And yeah, you could get a 40% damage increase, but you're probably not going to need it, and you're probably going to opt in for something like Petrify, which you can just constantly cast and get a massive boost to your critical strike damage, as well as crowd control enemies and just continue moving your character and casting skills as you cast your Petrify. So I think this is a good change overall to Lacerate, but my overall opinion on Lacerate is that they probably need to either remove this ultimate and replace it with a Grizzly Bear for companion builds, or they need to massively rework it and make it a heck of a lot better, and I just don't think that this is going to do that. Now, going down to some of the passive changes, you'll see here on Call of the Wild, they increased that multiplier from 10% now to 12%, and Call of the Wild is the companion skill damage multiplier, so that's a pretty nice overall buff to it. However, the bigger change for companions is going to be down in bug fixes, so we will get to that a little bit later in the video. Then for quick shift, and this is one of the ones I was really surprised by, and I'm really sad that they made this change, so let's go ahead and go over it. So previously on quick shift, or as it currently stands, when a shape-shifting skill transforms you into a different form, it deals 7% increased damage. And I will note that they recently buffed this 7%. It was previously 5%. So I was thinking they weren't going to touch this passive whatsoever. But I was completely wrong. So now, when shape-shifting into a new animal form, which is a really important part of this, you deal 1% increased damage for 3 seconds up to 6%. So this is actually a pretty big change to the passive, and honestly something I really wish that they hadn't have done. So now you're going to have to change into an animal form, so no longer getting the buff when you swap back to human, which I think is really unfortunate. And then also it's now going to be a stacking buff, making this far more complicated than it had to be. So the overall theme of this patch, in my opinion, and what the developers have said, is that their goal was to simplify things and kind of get rid of that damage on Tuesday feel of the game. However, for some reason, when they got down to quick shift, instead of leaving it like it was, they decided to add a whole lot of that into quick shift. So now you're going to have to definitely quick shift into an animal form, and you're also going to have to do it often so you actually receive the maximum buff from this passive. And then that buff isn't even as significant as it was when they recently changed it to 7%. So not really sure why they changed that. I think it's going to make this overall passive feel a lot less useful compared to what it currently does in Season 3. However, I'm hoping that my mind has changed when I get to test this out on the PTR, and you better believe I will be advocating for them to reverse the change if it feels really bad, but I'll save my hard opinion for when I actually get to test it out. But currently, I don't think this is a very good change. I think this is a change for the worst and an overcomplication of something that didn't really need it. Going down to height instances, again, another overall change, making it far more complicated than it needed to be. So previously, upon shapeshifting into a werebear or werewolf, you gained a 4% damage reduction against elites for 5 seconds, and this stacked up to 12%, so a nice little damage reduction there. Now, when shape-shifting into, again here, an animal form, which is, again, unfortunate, werebear grants 2% damage reduction and werewolf grants 2% movement speed. Each for 6 seconds. Bonuses are doubled when both are active. So what this looks like is they basically cut the damage reduction in half, gave you a little bit of movement speed, and then you have to have both of these bonuses active in order to actually get the full effect that you would have previously gotten from height instances in terms of damage reduction, which was the most important aspect of the passive. So again, guys, here, an overcomplication of a passive that didn't really need it. They could have just added movement speed into this passive instead of making it this convoluted mess of text. However, again, I'm going to save my hard opinion for when I get to test this out. But currently, I hope that they reverted back to its previous version and then just add movement speed to that. But again, I could be wrong about this, so I'll definitely be testing this out and giving them my feedback. Now going down to clarity, we see that they made a pretty nice little change here. So previously, you would gain 2 spirit when transforming into human form. No one used this passive whatsoever, and it's pretty terrible, so you can see why they didn't. Now, after casting a companion skill, your next core or wrath skills damage and critical strike chance are increased by 5 up to 15%. So this is actually a really nice change, albeit a bit clunky for some builds. So I think that's actually going to limit some of the builds that can actually get the most out of this specific passive. So you're probably not going to see builds like tornado builds or shred builds utilize this, because you'd have to cast a companion skill and then you'd have to cast a tornado and you'd repeat that process, and it would pretty much destroy your damage output. And the same thing with shred. You'd have to cast shred and then you cast a companion skill, and you can see why that would not necessarily work too well. However, For builds like, say, Trample Slide, this actually seems pretty useful because not only do you get the buff to the Landslide core skill, but then you're also going to get the buff to the Trample Wrath skill. So there could be a potential for a really nice damage increase to Trample Slide builds here, and I am also wondering if there's the potential to snapshot this into your Lightning Storm channeling. So what that means is basically you cast a companion skill, you receive this buff from Clarity, and then you start channeling Lightning Storm. And during the channeling of Lightning Storm, each tick of damage you get with Lightning Storm actually acquires this buff every single time. And that is definitely something I'm interested in testing out, because if it does snapshot into the channeling of Lightning Storm, it's going to be pretty powerful overall in terms of what it offers Lightning Storm builds. So this is definitely one of the better changes for the passives for Druid. Moving down to Digigrade Gate, it is now getting a little bit of a movement speed increase per skill point. So instead of 3%, it is 4%. However, my biggest gripe about this specific passive is that it only affects your werewolf form in 3 seconds after leaving werewolf form. So not really a huge buff, and honestly, because it is exclusively affecting werewolf form, I wish they would change this buff to give you somewhere around 5, 6, or 7% movement speed per skill point, so it actually feels a lot better when you're using it. Now looking at our legendary aspects, you'll see here Changeling's Dead has been changed, and this is something a lot of people are kind of disappointed about. So the previous version, it says damaging a poisoned enemy with a werebear skill will instantly deal 120 to 124% of the poisoning damage and consume the poisoning. Now it says you're going to deal 25 to 40% increased damage while hitting a poisoned enemy as a werebear or a crowd control enemy as a werewolf. Now, for me, this is actually a pretty sizable buff to werebear. So you're getting a 25 to 40% multiplicative damage increase, which 40% is actually pretty common to see now, to your werebear skills by hitting poisoned enemies. And the only one that's not really a big deal to me is the crowd control enemies as a werewolf. Now, as a werewolf, this actually might be pretty good for clearing trash mobs, but the problem is all of the top tier content coming to the game involves not just killing trash mobs, but killing bosses. And because you can't crowd control bosses outside of the stagger bar, it makes this one not as good. But for werebear, all you need to do now is poison enemies, and your werebear skills automatically deal 40% multiplicative damage. So in my opinion, this is actually a pretty good change for werebear, and it only really affected werebear initially, so I think it's actually a pretty good change. But we'll see when we get to test it out. Going down to Unsatiated, after killing an enemy with Shred, your next werewolf skill generates more spirit and deals more damage. Now, after killing an enemy with Shred, you gain 20 spirit, and your werewolf skills deal 10 to 25% increased damage when cast above 50 spirit. So for me, this is not really a good change to Unsatiated. I don't think that this is going to make this specific aspect any more viable than it currently is, so I don't really think anybody's going to run this whatsoever. Now for Blurred Beast, they went ahead and gave this a damage increase, so they went from 25 to 32% up to 25 to 35%. I still don't think anybody's going to be running this now, especially after the changes they made in Season 3. Now for Night Howlers here, this looks like a lot of information, but it really isn't. All they really did was, again, change the tag on Night Howlers to function as a shout skill. That's really all this says. It still does the exact same thing, gives you 5% to 10% critical strike chance, and then also affects your companions and nearby players. So this really isn't anything, they're just changing it to a shout. Now for All Might, it says that all shape-shifting skills contribute to the buff stacks, damage increase from 35 to 50% to 40 to 55%, and stun duration increase from 2 to 3 seconds. Now for me, this doesn't really change the viability of this specific aspect. There are just far too many aspects that give you more damage without requiring you to leap through this massive hoop of hitting 15 enemies with your werebear skills, so not really going to change my mind on whether I'm going to use this or not. Definitely not going to use Raw Might. And now down to the flavor of the month every single month, and that is the Shepherd's aspect. And if you can believe it, guys, they actually gave this thing a buff. So one of the most overused aspects in the game, something I really wish they would nerf into the ground, they actually gave it a buff to now affect all of your wrath skills. So if you were tired of the pet build meta, well, guess what? They doubled down on it, and now we're going to be running all of the same pet skills all over again for Season 4, and I cannot stand it. I wish they would absolutely nerf this thing into the ground. It gives you way too much core skill damage. I mean, you put this thing on a two-hander, you're getting a 20% multiplicative damage bonus for every single companion you have, and it's just ridiculous. So it pretty much pigeonholes every single druid build into running all 3 companion skills and running shepherds. And now with the bug fixes to retaliation, which we'll talk about a little bit later, you're going to have shepherds and stampede almost 100% of the time on every single build. And to me, that is absolutely terrible. So I hope at some point in time they completely change this. I hope it gets nerfed into the ground or it affects something completely different, because I do not like the current trend of every single build absolutely needing to run companions, or else your damage is absolutely terrible. So hopefully they change that in the future. But for now, guess what, guys? Companion builds are going to be the thing for Season 4. Going down to Mangled, previously, when you were struck as a werebear, you would have a % chance to gain 3 spirit. Now it says while in wearer form, you gain 10 to 25 spirit every 8 seconds. So I actually think this is a really great change, even though I don't think people are going to use it, because there are going to be other ways for you to generate spirit that you're not really going to need to take up an aspect slot to do it. But I like this stuff. Anything that adds a flat spirit generation to your character is definitely a welcome change for me. And the fact that we're also going to be able to get spirit generation affixes on our gear is going to be a nice change for the Druid as well. Now for the biggest aspect change in my opinion, and one that I think a lot of people are going to overlook, and that is the change to Mending Stone, guys. So it now says killing an enemy with any skill now replenishes the barrier as well as earth skills. So that is a big change and something I've been asking for Mending Stone for quite some time. One of the most unfortunate aspects of the Mending Stone aspect is that only earth skills would replenish your barrier. Now with this change, every single kill you get is going to replenish your barrier, and that is going to make barrier builds, especially those low life bulwark barrier builds out there this season, absolutely insanely tanky going into Season 4. So you better believe I am probably going to be running quite a few low life bulwark builds in hardcore for this season, and I am pretty excited about this change. I think it's going to make druids the tankiest class in the game. I mean, you're talking about infinite barrier all the time with an insane amount of damage reduction from damage reduction while injured, especially when you take into consideration greater affix rolls as well as masterworking. So there's a chance that we're never going to die. You run a low life bulwark build and you'll probably never die in Season 4, and I think that's going to be pretty cool. Maybe a bit overpowered, but I like the way it functions, so I'm a little bit biased there. And then for the last part, this is just saying that Echoing Fury is now going to be affecting the shout skills. Previously, only barbarians had shout skills, but as I mentioned in the video, Debilitating Roar as well as Bloodhowl are now going to be tagged as shout skills. So we're going to get the benefit from Echoing Fury, and what that is now your shout skills generate 5 to 10 primary resource per second while active. So your Bloodhowl as well as your Debilitating Roar are going to be giving you some spirit generations. So again, a pretty nice and welcome addition to the Druid class. However, I don't really think that is going to be as utilized as what they may think, because of the plain simple fact that Druids are sorely lacking a lot of aspect slots. So unlike Barbarian, we don't have 15 million aspect slots, so we're pretty limited as to what we can actually utilize on our builds, and I don't think that Druids are actually going to get a lot of use out of this. However, like I said, I'm always going to welcome more ways to generate spirit on our Druids. Now on to the unique items here, and I think this is a big disappointment that I did not see more reworks in terms of some of the Druid-specific uniques out there. One of the main ones is the Dolmenstone Amulet. That amulet specifically needs to be reworked in my opinion. I wish they would add movement speed to it. I also wish they would remove the ranks to wrath skills and just make it ranks to boulder skills, because the best aspect in the game for boulder cane builds is the Metamorphic Stone aspect, which shifts your boulder into a core skill, so it no longer actually benefits from the ranks to wrath skills that you have on the Dolmenstone Amulet. Also, I wish that they would give us a unique totem already. We do not have any unique totems in the game currently, and that is something I really would like them to do, and I really hope that when they do add a unique totem to the game, that it affects a skill that we actually enjoy using. So Anyway, let's talk about the flesh render, something that no one is going to use even after these changes unless you're making a gimmicky build, which most people don't want to do. So flesh render damage bonus increase from 10 to 15%, and the previous way it worked is debilitating roar and blood howl deal damage to nearby poison enemies increased by 15% for every 100 willpower you have. Now it says casting a defensive skill deals damage to nearby poison enemies increased by 15% for every 100 willpower you have. Like I said, I don't think this is going to do anything in terms of making this specific unique viable for the Druid class. However, I will say that because they did go ahead and change this to a defensive skill, something I want to test out here is if you can actually make a really cool innate bulwark build with this. So if you remember, one of the best builds in season 1 was innate bulwark spamming. And that's because innate bulwark was bugged where it was scaling inappropriately and doing a ton of damage to enemies. So my overall theory with the change with this specific unique is that there is a chance that you could potentially make a really cool innate bulwark build where you almost get a similar version of innate bulwark that you had in season 1, where you're constantly spamming bulwark and you're just blowing enemies up with this flesh render unique item. But I highly doubt the damage is going to be that potent, and I will be testing that out to see if that is the case. Now down to our Paragon, and again, these are insignificant changes, but we'll go over them. So for the tracker glyph, poison damage effect duration increased from 33 to 40%. So in my opinion, the problem with damage over time effects is not how long they last, it's how they actually scale into the late game. And until they actually rework the scaling of damage over time effects, they're absolutely useless as soon as you hit World Tier 4. Then on to Bane, poison effect double damage chance increase from 10 to 15%. So again, here the same problem. Damage over time effects don't really scale that well into the end game, so I don't really see this actually being that useful. And unfortunately, until they rework damage over time, the only damage over time that's going to be useful is the one that the enemy uses that pretty much destroys your entire health bar inside of a second. Then for the shapeshifter glyph, and this is one that's really grown on me, they're just giving it a overall increase to the critical strike chance, so now it's going from 20 to 25%. So I will definitely be using this glyph for certain builds, and I think this little increase to the critical strike chance is pretty cool. Now onto the Wilds glyph, they're giving it a 10% damage increase, which is pretty nice, but that's not actually the biggest change coming to the Wilds glyph. That's actually a bug fix that we're going to talk about in just a second. And then for the Inner Beast legendary node, so the previous version, after shapeshifting, your spirit costs are reduced by 10% for 5 seconds up to 30%. And again, another overcomplicated change made here in a patch where everything was supposed to be simplified. So now it says, after shapeshifting, your spirit costs are reduced by 5% for 10 seconds, up to 45%. If you reach 10 stacks, this bonus resets and reduces the cooldown of your ultimate skill by 5 seconds. So for me, this is actually a pretty terrible change. I really did enjoy the 30% spirit cost reduction you could get pretty easily just by shapeshifting a couple times. And this, in my opinion, actually makes it a lot harder to get that consistent reduction, because once you scale it all the way to 45%, it's then going to reset and give you an ultimate skill cooldown, which honestly, in my opinion, is absolutely insignificant, because if I wanted ultimate skill cooldown, I would just use flicker step boots and I would just evade through things and get massive amounts of cooldown and constantly spam my ultimate that way. And I think this is a pretty terrible change. And I wish they would have just buffed this overall resource cost reduction and left it exactly the same. Now going up here to the unique items that are being added to the Druid, we're getting the Earthbreaker unique ring. I wish this was a unique totem, for crying out loud. So it says landslide causes the ground to erupt in tectonic spikes, which continue to deal damage over time over 2 seconds. Casting landslide in this area has a 20 to 30% chance to cause additional landslide pillars to spawn within. So this unique ring actually sounds really good for landslide, trample slide, and subterranean builds, or the hybrid builds that utilize most of those skills. And I think it's going to be a really nice addition to those builds, much like the ascetic wraps were for the lightning storm builds for Druid. However, like I said, I really wish this wasn't a ring slot. However, I do wish they would have made this a unique totem instead of a unique ring, and I really hope that they give us some really cool affixes on this ring, so that way we don't lose any crit chance in our builds. Now for the Wild Heart Hunger unique, this is a unique pair of boots, unfortunately. When you shapeshift into a werewolf or werebear, you gain Wild Heart for 5 seconds. Wild Heart grants you 1 to 1.5% increased damage with shape-shifting skills every 2 seconds, stacking up to 20 times. So again, something that's a little bit too complicated here, and I don't necessarily think it's well explained, and you're probably going to have to test this out on your own. So the biggest question I have here is the increased damage with shape-shifting skills every 2 seconds. I'm not really sure how that's going to function. It says you gain Wild Heart for 5 seconds, stacking up to 20 times, but then it only gives you the damage increase every 2 seconds. So it doesn't really sound as good as it looks, and the fact that it's on a unique pair of boots, are you really going to want to sacrifice one of your mobility slots for these boots? Because you're going to have to hope that it has a movement speed affix roll, and then you're also going to have to hope that these boots have either evade stacks or the evade cooldown off of using a skill. If not, it's really going to make these boots feel pretty awful in terms of your overall mobility. And then it's definitely going to limit the amount of mobility slots you have. So are you going to give up your Metamorphosis for this? Are you going to give up your Ghost Walker for this? I don't necessarily think people will. So on its face, it looks like a nice little damage increase for your builds, but I don't think people are going to want to give up their boot slot, and I really wish, again, that they would have put this on a unique totem instead of a unique pair of boots. Now for the overlooked aspect of the Druid changes here, and that's the bug fixes. So they're fixing Wild Impulses. It's now going to give us that multiplicative damage instead of the additive damage. So definitely happy that that's going to happen. Then for the second bug fix, it says, fix an issue where Hurricane was not displaying decimal values for its duration when affected by the Endless Tempest passive. To me, the Endless Tempest passive is absolutely trash. They need to change this to just a flat duration increase. Giving it a percentage increase really doesn't do much for Hurricane because it's only up for 8 seconds, so 15% is a very minimal increase to the duration of Hurricane. I wish they would just change this to 2, 4, and 6 seconds or something along those lines, and I think that would really impact Hurricane quite a bit. Unfortunately, I don't think they're going to do that anytime soon, so this passive is still going to continue to be unused. Now on to the retaliation fix. So they fixed an issue where the damage bonus from retaliation could apply twice. So this basically makes retaliation completely useless compared to Stampede. Before, you could actually make the argument that you'd want to run retaliation over Stampede, but now that's not the case. So pretty much everybody is going to toss this one to the side and slot in Stampede. Unless you have an aspect slot open, you probably will not be using this. Now to the next one, it says fixed an issue where Storm Strike and Claw could attack in place instead of attempting to path the player. So this is nice. It's going to make keyboard and mouse players have a much easier time utilizing Stormclaw builds, so that's really cool. Then it says it fixed an issue where Bloodhound would not heal the player or properly regenerate spirit when equipped with the Night Howler's aspect. That's pretty good. Then they fixed an issue where fortify values generated by Safeguard was using base life instead of max life. So I'm really happy they did this. I like Safeguard on a lot of my landslide builds, and the fact that they made it scale properly is going to make it much more useful in terms of building a fortify. Now the one you've all been waiting for, it says fix an issue where the multiplicative damage from Wild's Glyph did apply for the passive attacks from companions. Now, when I initially read this, I think my mind inserted the N''T at the end of did and turned it to didn't, and I thought this was actually a positive bug fix for the Wild's Glyph overall, mainly because it was pretty lackluster already in terms of the damage your companions could actually do. So I am kind of wondering if this is a typo, if this was supposed to be didn't, because if it's not, it's actually a negative impact on Wilds, and even though companions are going to be receiving a sizable buff into Season 4, the Wilds Glyph is going to be significantly less useful in terms of what it does to your overall companions. So hopefully it is a typo. I'm hoping it's a typo. I would really hope that they're not actually going to reduce the amount of passive damage your companions deal, because in my opinion, that is the most important damage overall, because the active skills for your companion builds really don't seem to have that much oomph behind them, and I think the passive damage kind of makes up for that in some way. However, again, I will save my hard opinion until I actually get to test out the companion skills, and I'm really hoping that Ravens actually deals damage now. But that's really it for all the changes coming to the Druid for the PTR, and you better believe I will be testing all this out pretty thoroughly and giving them all the feedback on the Druid class, because that is the class that I love for Diablo 4. And if you're watching this video, I know that is the class that you love the most. So I definitely think that it does not really shake up the meta for the Druid. There are some nice landslide changes here with the new unique ring, and I do think that the changes to clarity were really nice as well. And obviously, the big one for me is going to be the change to Mending Stone. I think there's the potential for the Druid to be the most tanky class in the game, especially when running a low life bulwark build, because of the fact that now all of your skills will replenish your barrier. However, some of the changes that they made to passives like Quick Shift and Heightened Senses, I think are absolutely terrible and need to be reverted. I was actually really enjoying using some of the hybrid shred builds that utilize Pulverize and things of that nature. And one of the best passives in the builds was Quick Shift. So they just changed it, and now in my opinion, they massively nerfed it into whatever that hot mess of unnecessary complexity was down there with the new passive changes. So let's go ahead and look at what every single Druid build is going to look like into Season 4 if these changes stay as they currently are. So as you can see, guys, we are over here on Mobalytics, and we have 6 open skill slots, to which 4 of them are already taken up. Now, why is that? Well, because in order for you to push high tier pits, you're probably going to have to run Petrify, because it's going to be absolutely insane how powerful that ultimate is into Season 4. And then Shepherd's Aspect is still insanely overpowered in terms of what it gives you for a core skill damage. So you're going to run Ravens, Poison Creeper, and Wolves, and not because these skills are actually useful, but because they're going to further buff up your core skill damage. And to me, this is an absolute travesty for the Druid class. So in my opinion, Druid should probably be one of the most creative classes in the game. There's just so many different aspects of the class. You have Werebear, Werewolf, Human Form, you have lightning damage, earth skill damage, you have all of these different skills and damage types you can play around with. And the fact that we are basically pigeonholed into 4 different skills that take up our skill bar is pretty sad to me. So all that we're going to have open is probably a slot for a core skill and then a defensive skill here. So this is either going to be Lightning Storm, Tornadoes, Shred, or Trample, and this is probably going to be Bulwark or Debilitating Roar or some kind of damage mitigation defensive skill. Not really my ideal scenario for the Druid, but you guys can always let me know your opinions down in the comments section. I really cannot stand this meta, and the fact that it's going to continue into Season 4 is a massive miss for me. I cannot stand this right now. And then onto our Spirit Boons, a system that I think needs a complete rework for the Druid. We're still going to be running Weariness for the damage reduction, still going to be running Avian Wrath for the multiplicative critical strike damage, Pack Leader, or you're going to be running Calamity. And then on the stake, you're going to continue to run Combo for the Storm. And then going down here to the aspects, as you can see, guys, we are gleefully running Shepherds on the weapon and running the aspect of Stampede on the ring. And now you all are officially build creators for the Druid class for Diablo 4. And it's really that simple, guys. So again, guys, I think this is really unfortunate for the Druid class overall, the fact that we're continuing with this pet build meta. I cannot wait till they absolutely hammer this thing into the ground and we can have a lot more creativity for the Druid class, just like the way it should be. But anyway, guys, that's it for the video. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments section. Do you actually enjoy a lot of these changes coming to the Druid class in Season 4? Are you underwhelmed, much like I am, about the current changes that you've seen? And do you guys feel the same way I do about the companion build meta? Do you wish it would just go away already, or are you actually pretty happy with it overall? Either way, my overall feeling towards Season 4 is quite positive in spite of the lackluster changes that they've made to the Druid class, even though there are some really nice highlights like the change to Mending Stone, like the change to Clarity, as well as the unique ring for the landslide builds out there. So I do think those are really good, and I do welcome all of the spirit generation changes coming to the Druid as well. But anyway, guys, as always, I hope you guys are having a great day or a great night, depending on wherever you're from, and peace out, guys. I will see you in the next one.